The late afternoon sun hung low over the Wyoming territory, painting the endless expanse of sagebrush and rock in shades of amber and rust. A dry wind swept across the barren landscape, carrying with it the taste of dust and the promise of another scorching day to come. In the distance, the Laramie Mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in a haze that blurred the line between earth and sky. Samuel Thornton urged his bay stallion forward, his weathered hands steady on the reins despite the fatigue that weighed on his shoulders. At 42, he cut an imposing figure against the harsh backdrop of the frontier, tall and broad-shouldered, with premature silver threading through his dark hair and deep lines etched around eyes the color of winter ice. His fine wool coat and well-made boots marked him as a man of means. Yet there was something in his bearing that spoke of burdens carried too long, of a soul that had forgotten how to rest. The Thornton Ranch sprawled across 20,000 acres of prime grazing land, making Samuel one of the wealthiest men in the territory. His cattle numbered in the thousands. His horses were the finest bloodstock west of the Mississippi, and his bank accounts in Cheyenne could have bought him a life of ease in any eastern city. Yet here he rode, alone as always, returning from another fruitless negotiation with the railroad men who seemed determined to push their iron tracks through the heart of his land. The wind shifted, and Samuel's mount snorted nervously, ears pricking forward. Years of survival on the frontier had taught him to trust his horse's instincts. He reined in, scanning the desolate landscape with practiced eyes. Nothing moved, save for a lone hawk circling overhead and tumbleweeds skittering across the hard-packed earth. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been his imagination. A low, desperate moan carried on the wind. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip. Out here, miles from the nearest settlement, such sounds rarely boded well. Bandits, claim jumpers, and worse prowled these isolated stretches, preying on the unwary. Yet something in that pitiful cry stirred a memory he'd tried to bury. Another voice, long silenced, calling for help that never came. He guided his horse toward a ramshackle structure half hidden behind a cluster of cottonwoods, one of the many abandoned homesteads that dotted the territory like broken teeth. The soddy's roof had partially collapsed, and its door hung askew on rusted hinges. It was the kind of place decent folk avoided, a haven for drifters and outlaws. The sound came again, clearer now, a muffled sob of distress. Samuel dismounted, drawing his pistol in one smooth motion. His spurs clinked softly as he approached the doorway, every sense alert. The interior was dim, lit only by shafts of dusty light filtering through gaps in the walls. The smell hit him first, sweat, fear, and something else that made his jaw clench. In the corner, barely visible in the gloom, lay a figure. As his eyes adjusted, the details emerged with sickening clarity. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, lay bound hand and foot with a rough rope that had rubbed her wrists raw. A filthy strip of burlap covered her mouth, tied so tightly it had left angry marks on her cheeks. Her dress, once a modest blue calico, was torn and stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Dark hair spilled around her face in matted tangles, and her eyes, wide with terror and rimmed with tears, fixed on him with a mixture of hope and dread. Samuel holstered his weapon and dropped to his knees beside her, his fingers working quickly at the knots. The girl flinched at his touch, a strangled sound escaping from behind the gag. "Easy now," he said, his voice rougher than intended from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The rope around her wrists gave way first, and she immediately clawed at the cloth covering her mouth. Samuel caught her hands gently, noting how they trembled like autumn leaves. "Let me," he said, reaching for the knot at the back of her head. The fabric was damp with saliva and tears. The knot pulled so tight his fingers struggled to find purchase. When it finally loosened, he carefully pulled the gag away. The girl gasped, her chest heaving as she gulped in air. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her throat working convulsively. When she finally spoke, The words came out as a broken whisper that seemed to echo through the abandoned space and straight into his chest. "I can't breathe." Samuel felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the wall he'd built around his heart. Those 3 words, spoken with such desperate relief, transported him back to another time, another place, a burning cabin, smoke-filled rooms, and voices calling out that he'd been too late to save. He pushed the memory aside and focused on the rope binding her ankles. His movements careful but efficient. The girl, for she was little more than that, despite her ordeal, watched him with eyes that seemed to catalog his every move, as if trying to determine whether he was savior or simply another form of torment. "Can you sit up?" he asked once she was free. She nodded, struggling to push herself upright. Samuel steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, noting how she trembled beneath his touch. In the better light, he could see the full extent of her condition. Dehydration had left her lips cracked and her skin sallow, and bruises in various stages of healing marked her arms. "Water," she croaked. Samuel retrieved his canteen from his saddlebag and held it to her lips, cautioning her to drink slowly despite her obvious desperation. She obeyed, taking small sips while keeping her eyes fixed on his face. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 2 days. Maybe 3? I lost track." Her voice was hoarse, each word an effort. "Who did this to you?" Fear flashed across her features, and she shrank back against the wall. "They'll come back. They always come back." Samuel's expression hardened. "Not while I'm here. They won't. Can you ride?" She nodded, though doubt clouded her eyes. He helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed unsteadily. Without asking permission, he swept her up in his arms. She weighed next to nothing, as insubstantial as a bird. "My name is Samuel Thornton," he said as he carried her toward his horse. "I own the Triple T Ranch about 10 miles north of here. You'll be safe there." "Safe," she repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. I can't pay you. I have nothing." "I'm not asking for payment." He settled her in the saddle and swung up behind her, securing one arm around her waist to keep her steady. She tensed at the contact but didn't pull away. As they rode out into the fading light, Samuel found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way she gradually relaxed against his chest, the soft sound of her breathing, the trust she was placing in a stranger. The Triple T materialized out of the gathering dusk like a small city, barns and corrals, bunkhouses and smithy, all dominated by the main house with its wraparound porch and windows glowing warmly in the twilight. Cowboys looked up from their evening chores, curiosity plain on their faces as their normally solitary boss rode in with a woman in his arms. "Jake," Samuel called to his foreman, "send someone for Doc Morrison. Tell him it's urgent." "Yes, sir, Mr. Thornton." If Jake was surprised by the request, his weathered face didn't show it. The ranch hands had learned long ago not to question their employer's rare breaks from routine. Samuel carried the girl into the house, past the startled housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, and up the stairs to one of the guest rooms that hadn't seen use in years. He set her gently on the bed, stepping back as Mrs. Chen bustled in with her usual efficiency. "Poor child," the older woman clucked, taking in the girl's condition with a practiced eye. "I'll draw a bath and find some clean clothes. You go on now, Mr. Thornton. This is women's work." Samuel hesitated at the door, struck by how small and vulnerable the girl looked against the pristine white sheets. She was watching him with those dark eyes, something unreadable in their depths. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded curtly and left, but her words followed him down the hall as he poured himself a whiskey in his study. Samuel tried to ignore the unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a sensation he'd thought buried along with his wife and daughter 5 years ago. He'd rescued the girl out of basic human decency. Nothing more. Come morning, he'd see her safely to town, and that would be the end of it. Yet, as night settled over the ranch and he found himself listening for sounds from upstairs, Samuel Thornton had the unsettling feeling that his carefully ordered world had just tilted on its axis. The ghost of her words, "I can't breathe," echoed in his mind, awakening something he'd thought dead forever. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. Change was coming to the Triple T Ranch, whether its owner was ready or not. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains, painting delicate patterns across the guest room floor. The girl stirred, momentarily disoriented by the softness of the bed and the clean scent of lavender soap on her skin. For a heartbeat, she wondered if the rescue had been a dream, but the ache in her wrists and the fine cotton nightgown she wore told her otherwise. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Chen entered with a breakfast tray, her round face creased with maternal concern. "Good morning. Dear, how are you feeling?" "Better, ma'am. Thank you." The girl's voice was still hoarse, but stronger than the night before. "None of that ma'am business. I'm Mrs. Chen, and you eat every bite of this breakfast. You hear? You're nothing but skin and bones." As the girl obediently spooned porridge into her mouth. Mrs. Chen bustled about, laying out a simple brown dress and undergarments. "Mr. Thornton asked if you'd join him in his study when you're ready. No rush. Mind you, that man's got nowhere pressing to be for once." After Mrs. Chen left, the girl dressed slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons. The dress fit reasonably well, though it hung loose on her thin frame. She caught a reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Clean, hair braided neatly, bruises fading to yellow and green. She looked almost respectable, though fear still lurked in her dark eyes. The house was grander than anything she'd known, with polished wood floors and oil paintings lining the hallways. She found the study by following the scent of coffee and tobacco, pausing at the threshold to gather her courage. Samuel stood by the window, silhouetted against the morning light. He'd traded yesterday's fine coat for work clothes, denim pants and a blue flannel shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders. When he turned, she was struck again by his eyes, ice blue but not cold, carrying a weight of sorrow that matched her own. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a leather chair near the fireplace. "How are you feeling?" "Much improved. Mr. Thornton, I'm grateful for your kindness." "Samuel," he corrected. "May I ask your name?" She hesitated, fingers twisting in her lap. "Grace McKenna." "Well, Miss McKenna, Doc Morrison says you'll make a full recovery with rest and proper meals. You're welcome to stay as long as needed." I couldn't impose." "It's no imposition." His tone brooked no argument. "Now, I need to ask about the men who did this to you. They could pose a threat to my ranch." Grace's composure crumbled. "They'll come looking. They always find what they're hunting." "Who are they?" "The Carlisle gang. Tom Carlisle and his boys run a business out of Laramie." She swallowed hard. "They grab girls traveling alone, promise them work as seamstresses or shop clerks. By the time we'd realize the truth, we're too far from home, too deep in debt to them for travel expenses. Those who try to run." She touched her wrist where the rope marks still showed. Samuel's expression darkened. He'd heard whispers of such operations, but had dismissed them as frontier tales. "You were trying to escape." "I was heading to my aunt in California. My parents died of fever last winter, and I sold everything for train fare. I was changing trains in Laramie when a nice-dressed woman approached me about a position at a dress shop. She seemed so kind, so helpful." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I was a fool. You were desperate and alone. That doesn't make you foolish." Grace looked up, surprised by the understanding in his voice. "I slipped away 3 nights ago while they were drinking. Made it as far as that shack before they caught up. They said they'd leave me there to think about my choices, that I'd be begging to come back after a few days without water." The sound of horses in the yard drew Samuel to the window. Below, cowboys were saddling up for the morning's work, their voices carrying on the crisp air. This was his domain, his carefully controlled world where nothing happened without his say. "You're under my protection now," he said quietly. "The Carlisle gang won't touch you here. You don't know them. They have connections, lawmen in their pocket, and I have 20 armed cowboys, the best lawyer in Wyoming, and enough money to buy my own law if needed." He turned from the window. "Though I prefer solving problems more directly." Something in his tone made her shiver, but not from fear. There was steel beneath his refined exterior, a hardness earned through survival in unforgiving country. A commotion outside interrupted them. Jake burst through the door without knocking, his weathered face grim. "Boss, we got company. 3 riders coming up the North Road, asking about a runaway girl." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward where his gun belt usually hung. "How far out?" "Maybe 10 minutes. Want me to turn them away?" "No. Have the boys go about their business as usual, but keep their rifles handy. I'll meet our visitors at the main gate." He glanced at Grace, who had gone pale. "Jake, take Miss McKenna to the root cellar. Bar the door and don't open it until I say." "I won't hide," Grace said, standing abruptly. "I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. This isn't up for debate." Samuel's voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Jake." The foreman gently but firmly guided Grace from the room. Samuel strapped on his gun belt, checking the loads in his Colt before heading outside. The morning had turned gray, clouds rolling in from the mountains with the promise of an early autumn storm. He positioned himself at the ranch's main entrance, thumbs hooked casually in his belt but ready to draw. Behind him, he sensed rather than saw his men taking strategic positions in the barn loft, behind water troughs, along the bunkhouse wall. The Triple T protected its own. 3 riders approached through the swirling dust, hard-looking men with the branded faces of those who lived outside the law. The leader, a thick-set man with greasy black hair and a scar bisecting his left cheek, reined up just outside the gate. "Morning, friend," the man said, showing yellowed teeth in what might have been a smile. "Name's Bill Hartley. We're looking for some stolen property that might have wandered this way. This is private land." Samuel replied evenly. "No stolen property here." "Well now, you haven't even heard what we're looking for. Young woman, about 20, dark hair, troubled in the head. Poor thing. Ran off from her family, and they're mighty worried. Haven't seen anyone matching that description." Hartley's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we look around? Wouldn't want you harboring a fugitive without knowing it." "I do mind. Like I said, this is private property." One of the other riders, younger and clearly itching for trouble, spoke up. "You know who you're talking to. Old man. Mister. Carlisle don't like being told no." "Then, Mister, Carlisle and I have something in common." Samuel said, "I don't like uninvited guests." The tension stretched taut as a telegraph wire. Hartley's hand drifted toward his sidearm, but something in Samuel's stance, in the too quiet ranch yard, made him reconsider. "This ain't over," Hartley said finally. "Mister, Carlisle's got legal papers on that girl, debt bonds. You interfere with lawful recovery of property, you'll answer to the territorial judge. I look forward to it. Now get off my land." The 3 men wheeled their horses around and galloped away, dust clouds marking their retreat. Samuel waited until they were specks on the horizon before relaxing his stance. "Jake," he called, "bring Miss McKenna back to the house and send a rider to town. I want Marshal Brennan out here before nightfall." As the ranch returned to its normal rhythm, Samuel found himself troubled by more than just the threat of the Carlisle gang. The fear in Grace McKenna's eyes, the desperation in her voice when she'd spoken of freedom. It stirred memories he'd tried to bury with whiskey and work. That evening, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the plains, Grace joined him for dinner. She'd regained some color, though she startled at every crack of lightning. They ate in companionable silence until she finally spoke. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I could be lying about everything." Samuel set down his fork, considering. 5 years ago, my wife and daughter were traveling to Denver to visit Sarah's sister. Their stagecoach was robbed. The bandits. He paused, the words still difficult. "They didn't have to kill them. Sarah had already given them her jewelry, her money, but they did anyway. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered. "I wasn't there. Couldn't protect them. Couldn't even find the men responsible. Though I spent 2 years trying." He met her eyes. "I couldn't save them, but I can help you." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like 1,000 fingers. In the flickering lamplight, Grace looked impossibly young and fragile. Yet there was strength in her too, the kind forged in hardship and desperation. "I won't bring trouble to your door," she said. "Come morning, I'll leave. You'll do no such thing." His voice was firm but not unkind. "You're staying put until this matter with Carlyle is resolved. After that," he shrugged. "We'll see." As the storm raged outside, neither of them acknowledged what was already beginning, the slow thaw of 2 frozen hearts, the tentative connection between 2 souls marked by loss. The Triple T Ranch had seen its share of drama over the years, but nothing quite like the quiet revolution taking place in its dining room, where a bitter rancher and a desperate young woman found themselves sharing more than just a meal. The town of Cedar Ridge sprawled along the banks of the Laramie River like a mongrel dog basking in the sun, part respectable commerce, part lawless frontier. Main Street boasted a general store, bank, and church at one end, while the other dissolved into saloons, gaming halls, and establishments of questionable virtue. It was a Saturday afternoon when Samuel rode in, and the weekly cattle auction had drawn ranchers and buyers from across the territory. He hitched his horse outside Morrison's dry goods, intending only to collect supplies and gauge the town's mood. 3 weeks had passed since Grace's arrival at the Triple T, and while the Carlyle gang hadn't returned, Samuel knew they were planning something. Men like that didn't forget debts, real or imagined. "Afternoon, Mr. Thornton." Henry Morrison greeted him from behind the counter. The shopkeeper's usual friendliness seemed strained. "Haven't seen you in town lately. Been busy with the ranch." Samuel handed over his list. The usual order. "Henry." Morrison busied himself gathering items, but Samuel noticed how his eyes kept darting toward the window. "Heard you got a visitor out at your place. News travels fast." "That it does." Morrison lowered his voice. "Tom Carlyle's been making noise about it. Says you're harboring a thief who owes him $300. Since when does Carlyle deal in anything honest enough to create legal debt? Since Judge Harwick started taking his money." Morrison glanced around nervously. "Carlyle's got papers. Sam, legal documents saying that girl signed a work contract. Says she took advance wages and ran." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd suspected Carlyle had influence, but a territorial judge in his pocket changed things. Forged papers, no doubt. Maybe so, but Harwick won't see it that way. Morrison finished packing the supplies. "You've got friends in this town, Sam, but Carlyle's got fear on his side. People remember what happened to the Farleys when they crossed him." The Farleys had owned a small spread east of town until they'd refused to sell to one of Carlyle's associates. Their barn had burned. Their cattle had sickened, and eventually they'd left the territory entirely. The sheriff had investigated, but no proof was ever found. Samuel paid for his supplies and stepped back into the afternoon sun. Across the street, the Silver Dollar Saloon was doing brisk business. Through the batwing doors, he could see cowboys and townsmen bellied up to the bar, and at a corner table, Tom Carlyle himself holding court. Carlyle was a big man gone to seed, with thinning red hair and the florid complexion of a dedicated drinker. His expensive suit couldn't hide the brutality in his small eyes or the cruel set of his mouth. He was flanked by 2 of his enforcers, including the scarred Hartley who'd visited the ranch. Samuel crossed the street with deliberate steps, pushing through the saloon doors. Conversation died as patrons recognized him. Carlyle looked up from his cards, a smile spreading across his fleshy face. "Well, well, the great Samuel Thornton graces us common folk with his presence." Carlyle's voice was oily with false bonhomie. "Boys, make room for the gentleman." "I'll stand," Samuel said. "This won't take long. Direct and to the point. I admire that. Carlyle set down his cards. I assume you're here about my property. Miss McKenna is not property. According to Judge Harwick, she has signed a contract for domestic service, took $300 advance on wages, then ran off. Carlyle produced a folded document from his vest. All legal and proper. Samuel didn't bother looking at the papers. We both know what your domestic service entails. Careful. Thornton. That sounds like slander. Carlyle's smile never wavered. I run legitimate businesses. Just because a girl changes her mind about honest work doesn't make me a villain. And the rope marks on her wrists. The bruises. Troubled girls sometimes need restraining for their own good. Doc Morrison can attest she was prone to fits when she first arrived in town. Isn't that right, Doc? Samuel turned to see Dr. Morrison at the bar, the elderly physician staring intently at his whiskey. After a long moment, the doctor mumbled, "The girl did seem distressed when I first examined her." The betrayal stung, but Samuel couldn't blame the old man. Carlyle had ways of ensuring cooperation. "Here's my offer," Carlyle continued. "Return the girl, and we'll call it square. Keep her, and I'll have the sheriff arrest you for harboring a fugitive. Your choice. And here's my counteroffer," Samuel said quietly. "Leave Wyoming territory. Tonight. Don't come back." Hartley half rose from his chair, hand moving toward his gun. "You threatening Mr. Carlyle?" "I'm giving him advice." Samuel's hand rested casually near his own weapon. "The same advice I'd give any man who traffics in human misery." The saloon held its breath. Carlyle's face flushed darker, but he gestured for Hartley to sit. "You've got brass, Thornton, but brass won't stop the law. Sheriff Daniels will be paying you a visit real soon. I'll be sure to have coffee ready." Samuel turned and walked out, feeling the weight of hostile stares on his back. Outside. He noticed how quickly people averted their eyes, how conversations stopped as he passed. Carlyle's influence was spreading like a disease through Cedar Ridge. At the newspaper office, he found William Garrett setting type for the next edition. The editor looked up with relief. "Sam, thank God. I was hoping you'd come by. What's the word, Bill?" Garrett glanced toward the door, then motioned Samuel to the back room. "Carlyle's been spreading his version of events. Says the McKenna girl is a con artist who preys on wealthy men. Some folks are buying it." "And the rest?" "Too scared to say otherwise. Carlyle's got Judge Harwick coming to town next week for the autumn court session. Word is he'll issue a formal warrant then." Samuel absorbed this information. A warrant from a territorial judge would bring U.S. Marshals into play, men he couldn't simply turn away from his gate. "There's more," Garrett continued. "I've been digging into Carlyle's operation. Got a source in Laramie who says at least a dozen girls have disappeared through his employment agency over the past 2 years. Most end up in mining camps or military posts, if you understand my meaning. Can you print it? Not without proof, and my source is too frightened to go public." Garrett rubbed his face wearily. "Carlyle's got this town by the throat. Sam, even Sheriff Daniels is in his pocket now." Samuel had suspected as much. John Daniels was a weak man who'd won election by promising not to interfere with the town's profitable vices. "What about Marshal Brennan?" "Federal law only applies if Carlyle crosses state lines. As long as he keeps his business in Wyoming territory, Brennan can't touch him without evidence of federal crimes." Samuel left the newspaper office with a heavy heart. The law, which should have protected the innocent, had been twisted to serve the corrupt. As he loaded his supplies, he noticed Grace's reflection in the store window across the street. She was standing on the boardwalk outside the millinery shop, wearing one of Sarah's old dresses and a borrowed bonnet. His first instinct was anger. He'd told her to stay at the ranch, but as he watched her studying the displayed hats with wistful longing, something else stirred in his chest. She looked like any young woman enjoying a day in town, not the frightened creature he'd found 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Chen emerged from the shop, packages in hand. The two women chatted easily as they walked toward the buggy Samuel now noticed parked nearby. Jake sat in the driver's seat, rifle across his lap, eyes constantly scanning the street. Mr. Thornton. He turned to find Margaret Sinclair, the banker's wife, approaching with determined steps. She was one of the few women in town who didn't defer to their husband's business interests. Mrs. Sinclair, I wanted you to know, she said quietly, that not everyone believes Carlyle's lies. That poor girl's story is written in her eyes for anyone with sense to read it. I appreciate that, ma'am. The Ladies' Temperance Society has been documenting the disappearances. We can't prove anything, but we know. She pressed a folded paper into his hand. Names and dates. Maybe it will help. As she bustled away, Samuel unfolded the paper. 12 names were listed in neat handwriting, with dates and brief descriptions. Mary Patterson, age 19, arrived from Ohio, June 1879, disappeared July 1879. Elizabeth Mills, age 22, arrived from Missouri, September 1879, disappeared October 1879. The list went on, a damning chronicle of destroyed lives. Samuel tucked the paper carefully into his vest pocket. It might not be legal proof, but it was ammunition of another kind. He was preparing to leave when a commotion erupted near the saloon. Hartley and another of Carlyle's men had cornered Jake and the women beside their buggy. Grace stood frozen as Hartley leered at her. Well, look what we found. The runaway herself. Pretty as you please. Samuel crossed the distance in quick strides. Problem here, Jake? No, sir, the foreman replied steadily. These gentlemen were just leaving. Don't think so, Hartley said. Mister, Carlyle wants a word with his property. The lady is under my protection. Samuel's voice carried clearly across the street. Touch her, and you'll answer to me. Big talk for one man. He's not alone, a voice called out. Samuel glanced back to see Robert McCaffrey, owner of the Double Bar Ranch, stepping out of the bank. The lady's with Thornton. That makes her untouchable. Other ranchers began emerging from shops and saloons, forming a loose semicircle. Not all were friends of Samuel's, but they understood the code of the frontier. When a man extended his protection, it meant something. Hartley backed away, spitting in the dust. This ain't over. As the enforcer retreated, Grace looked up at Samuel with eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry. I just wanted to see the town. I didn't mean... You have nothing to apologize for, he said firmly. You're not a prisoner at the Triple T. The ride back to the ranch was subdued. Grace sat in the buggy with Mrs. Chen while Samuel rode alongside, alert for any sign of pursuit. The confrontation in town had made things clear. Carlyle wouldn't back down, and the corrupt law was on his side. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the rangeland, Samuel stood on his porch wrestling with the decision before him. He could send Grace away, perhaps to California as she'd originally planned. It would be the sensible choice, the safe choice. But when she joined him on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill, he knew he'd already made his decision. Some fights were worth having, even when the odds were stacked against you. They won't stop, Grace said quietly. Carlyle's men. They'll keep coming until... Then we'll be ready for them. She studied his profile in the fading light. Why does my fate matter so much to you? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, listening to the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. Because some things are worth standing for, even when standing is dangerous. My Sarah understood that. It's time I remembered it too. As stars began to pierce the darkening sky, they stood together in companionable silence. Two souls preparing for the storm that was surely coming. The autumn wind howled across the plains like a wounded animal, driving sheets of dust against the Triple T Ranch buildings. It had been 2 days since the confrontation in town, and an eerie quiet had settled over the land, the kind that preceded violence on the frontier. Samuel stood in his study, cleaning his Winchester rifle with methodical precision. Through the window, he could see his men positioned around the compound. Jake had doubled the night watch, and no one rode out alone anymore. The ranch had transformed from a working cattle operation into an armed camp. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Grace entered, carrying a tray with coffee and sandwiches. She'd taken to helping Mrs. Chen with household duties, insisting she earn her keep despite Samuel's protests. "You missed supper," she said, setting the tray on his desk. "Mrs. Chen is worried you're not eating enough. Mrs. Chen worries too much." But he accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Grace's hands no longer trembled when she poured. "The men are nervous," she said quietly. "Some are talking about leaving. I don't blame them. This isn't their fight, but they're staying. For now." Samuel set down the rifle. "Grace, I need you to consider. I'm not leaving." Her voice held steel he hadn't heard before. "I've spent months running, hiding, being afraid. I won't do it anymore. This could end badly. It already has, for too many girls." She pulled the list Margaret Sinclair had given him from her pocket. "I knew Mary Patterson. We traveled on the same train from Ohio. She was going to be a school teacher." Her voice caught. 16 years old, with dreams of educating frontier children. Now she's somewhere, if she's even alive. Samuel studied her face in the lamplight. The frightened girl he'd rescued was still there, but overlaid now with something harder, more determined. "You're not responsible for what happened to them." "No, but I survived when they didn't. That has to mean something." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, many of them, riding hard. Samuel grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. Grace close behind, despite his gesture for her to stay back. Jake met them on the porch. 15 riders, maybe 20, coming from the South Road. Samuel's gut tightened. Carlisle had finally made his move. Get the men to defensive positions. Anyone who wants to leave can go now with no hard feelings and a full month's pay. Jake grinned tightly. "Already asked. We're all staying, boss." The riders materialized out of the dust storm like specters, spreading out in a semicircle before the ranch gate. Tom Carlisle sat at their center, his bulk making his horse labor. Beside him rode a thin man in a black suit. Judge Harwick, Samuel presumed. Sheriff Daniels was there too, looking uncomfortable but present nonetheless. "Thornton!" Carlisle's voice boomed across the yard. "I've come for my property, all legal and proper this time." Samuel stepped forward, rifle held casually but ready. His men remained hidden but present. Shadows in windows, silhouettes in doorways. "State your business and be gone." Judge Harwick urged his horse forward. "Mr. Thornton, I am Judge Cornelius Harwick of the Territorial Court. I have here a duly executed warrant for the return of one Grace McKenna, who is under legal contract to Mr. Carlisle." "Let me see this warrant." The judge produced a document, which Jake retrieved and brought to Samuel. Even in the failing light, Samuel could see it was official, sealed and signed with all the proper authorities. "This warrant is based on fraudulent claims," Samuel said. "Miss McKenna signed nothing willingly." "That's for the court to decide." Harwick replied smoothly. "For now. The law requires her return. Refuse, and you'll be charged with obstruction of justice." "And if I demand a proper hearing?" The hearing was held in absentia. Miss McKenna failed to appear to contest the charges. Harwick's smile was thin and satisfied. "The law has been followed to the letter." Grace stepped out onto the porch despite Samuel's attempt to stop her. "I'll testify now. I'll tell everyone what really—" "You'll be silent," Harwick snapped. "A contract breaker and thief has no standing to speak." "She's no thief," Samuel said dangerously. "The court has ruled otherwise." Harwick gestured to Sheriff Daniels. "Sheriff, do your duty." Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Sam, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Just send the girl out, and we'll be on our way. The only way she leaves is over my dead body." "That can be arranged," Hartley called out, hand hovering near his pistol. The moment stretched taut. 24 men poised on the edge of violence. The wind gusted, sending dust devils spinning between the opposing forces. Samuel could feel his men's tension, fingers on triggers, waiting for the word. Then Grace did something unexpected. She walked down the porch steps, head high, moving toward Carlisle's group. "Grace, no!" Samuel started after her, but she held up a hand. "I won't have bloodshed for me," she said clearly. "I'll go." "The hell you will!" Samuel caught her arm. "Get back in the house." She turned to him, and he saw tears streaming down her face. "You have a life here, a ranch, men who depend on you. I won't let Carlisle destroy that. Some things are worth fighting for, and some fights can't be won with guns." She gently pulled free of his grasp. "Trust me." Something in her eyes made him hesitate. She walked steadily toward Carlisle's group, but as she passed Jake, she stumbled slightly. The foreman steadied her, and in that brief contact, Samuel saw her press something into his hand. "Smart girl." Carlisle sneered as she approached. "Hartley, tie her hands." "Don't want her running again." As Hartley dismounted with a length of rope, Grace spoke again. "I'll come peacefully, but I have conditions." "You're in no position to make demands." Harwick said, "I have information about your operations that certain people would find very interesting." Grace's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "Names, dates, locations, insurance, you might say." Carlisle's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing. Mary Patterson, Elizabeth Mills, Dorothy Hartman." With each name, Carlisle's face darkened. "Shall I continue, or would you prefer to discuss this privately?" "Bring her," Carlisle ordered Hartley. "We'll sort this out back in town." "No," Grace said. "We settle this here and now. Full payment of my supposed debt, plus a written release from any claims. In exchange, I keep quiet about what I know." "You think you can blackmail me?" Carlisle's voice was dangerous. "I think you're a businessman who understands profit and loss." Grace stood straight despite the fear Samuel could see in her rigid posture. "My silence is worth more than $300. Carlisle studied her for a long moment, then laughed. An ugly sound. "You've got spine, girl. More than most." He nodded to Harwick. "Write up a release. We'll call this debt settled." "Tom, you can't be serious." Hartley protested. "Shut up." Carlisle's eyes never left Grace. "But hear this, girl. You ever speak of my business, ever cause me trouble, and I'll find you. There ain't a place in this territory you can hide." While Harwick prepared the document, Samuel fought the urge to act. Every instinct screamed at him to protect Grace, to drive these men from his land with hot lead. But she'd asked him to trust her, and despite everything, he did. The release was signed and witnessed, Sheriff Daniels looking relieved that violence had been avoided. Grace took the document with steady hands, though Samuel noticed how white her knuckles were as she gripped it. "We're done here," Carlisle announced. "But Thornton, you'd best keep your nose out of my business from now on. Next time, that girl won't be around to save your hide." The riders wheeled and departed, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Grace stood alone in the yard until they were gone. Then her knees buckled. Samuel caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her in his arms. "What did you give Jake?" he asked as he carried her inside. She managed a weak smile. "Margaret Sinclair's list and a letter I wrote last night, detailing everything I witnessed in Carlisle's custody. Jake knows to get it to Marshal Brennan if anything happens to me." That was a dangerous gamble. Men like Carlisle understand leverage. I had to make myself more valuable free than captive. She shuddered. "But I've never been so scared." Samuel settled her on the parlor sofa. Mrs. Chen fussing over her with blankets and tea. As the adrenaline faded, he found himself both impressed and disturbed by Grace's courage. She'd faced down one of the most dangerous men in the territory with nothing but words and wit. "It's not over," he said quietly. "Carlisle won't forget this." "No, but he'll think twice before moving against us openly." Grace accepted the tea gratefully. "I bought us time. Nothing more." "Time for what?" "To find real evidence. To expose what he's doing." Her eyes met his. "Those girls deserve justice. Samuel, and men like Carlisle only understand one kind of justice in the end." Samuel knew she was right. They'd won this battle through cleverness and bluff, but the war was far from over. Carlyle would regroup, find new ways to strike at them, and when he did, words wouldn't be enough. Jake appeared in the doorway. "Boss, Ryder's coming, but it's Marshal Brennan and 2 deputies. Hope flickered in Samuel's chest. Perhaps their message had already reached the federal lawman. He went out to meet them, leaving Grace in Mrs. Chen's capable hands. Brennan was a tall, weathered man with intelligent eyes and a reputation for honesty. He dismounted wearily, accepting Samuel's offer of coffee. "Got an interesting letter from your foreman," Brennan said, "along with a list that matches some missing persons reports I've been collecting. Mind if we talk?" For the first time in days, Samuel felt the tide might be turning. He glanced back at the house where lamplight glowed warmly in the windows, where Grace was safe for now. "Come in, Marshal. We have a lot to discuss." As they entered the house, the wind began to die down, and stars appeared through gaps in the clouds. The storm had passed, for now, but Samuel knew this was merely the quiet between battles, and when the next one came, they'd need to be ready with more than just courage and clever words. The Laramie Mountains loomed dark against the star-filled sky as Samuel and Grace rode higher into the wilderness. Behind them, the Triple T Ranch had vanished into the pre-dawn darkness, and ahead lay only the unknown, rocky trails, dense pine forests, and the promise of temporary safety. They'd left quietly 3 hours before sunrise, after Jake had brought word of Carlyle's men gathering in town. Marshal Brennan was building a case, but it would take time they didn't have. Carlyle's release of Grace's debt had been a public humiliation, and such men didn't forgive easily. "There's a line shack about 10 miles up." Samuel called over his shoulder. "We'll rest the horses there." Grace nodded, clutching the saddle horn of the gentle mare Samuel had chosen for her. She'd never been much of a rider, but desperation was a quick teacher. Her carpetbag of belongings, pitifully small, was tied behind her saddle. The trail grew steeper, winding between massive boulders and stands of aspen that whispered secrets in the wind. Samuel led them with the confidence of a man who knew every deer path and stream crossing. This was his country, wild and unforgiving, but honest in its dangers. As the sun painted the peaks gold and crimson, they reached the line shack, a sturdy log structure built into a sheltered grove. Samuel had used it during roundups, when cattle strayed into the high country. Now it would serve as their refuge. "Go inside and rest," he told Grace as he unsaddled the horses. "I'll take care of the animals." But she stayed to help, her movements efficient despite her obvious exhaustion. They worked in companionable silence, the simple tasks a relief after days of tension. When the horses were settled with water and the grain Samuel had packed, they entered the cabin together. It was sparse but clean, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough wooden table, and 2 narrow bunks. Samuel had stocked it with supplies each spring, a habit that now proved fortunate. As he built a fire, Grace unpacked what food misses. Chen had hurriedly prepared. "She wanted to come with us," Grace said softly. "I had to convince her we'd be fine. You were right, too. This is no journey for her." Samuel fed kindling to the growing flames. "Though I wonder if it's any journey for you either. I'm stronger than I look. I'm beginning to believe that." They ate a simple breakfast of biscuits and dried beef, the fire crackling warmly as the mountain cold pressed against the windows. Outside, a hawk circled lazily, and the wind sang through the pines. It was peaceful, deceptively so. "How long can we stay here?" Grace asked. "A few days, maybe a week. Jake will send word when it's safe to return." Samuel studied her across the table. "Or we could keep riding. Denver's 3 days north. You could catch a train to California, start fresh." "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" The question hung between them like morning mist. Samuel found himself unable to meet her eyes. "I want you safe. Everything else." He trailed off, unsure how to voice the feelings that had been growing despite his efforts to suppress them. "I don't want to run anymore," Grace said firmly. Carlyle took my parents' money, my dignity, my freedom. I won't let him take anything else. He could take your life. Then at least I'll die standing up." She rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the wilderness. "My father was a minister. Did I tell you that? He used to say that evil flourishes when good people do nothing. I did nothing while those other girls disappeared. Not anymore." Samuel joined her at the window, close enough to catch the scent of lavender soap in her hair. "You're not responsible for Carlyle's crimes." "No, but I'm responsible for what I do with my freedom." She turned to face him, and suddenly the space between them seemed very small. "You gave that back to me, Samuel. You stood against armed men for a stranger. Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with truths he'd buried deep. "Because I've spent 5 years dying inside, going through the motions of living without feeling anything. Then I found you in that shack, heard you say you couldn't breathe, and something in me woke up." His voice roughened. "Maybe I saved you, but you saved me too." Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Without thinking, she reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against the stubble on his jaw. "Sarah was a lucky woman, to be loved by you. I wasn't there when she needed me. You can't protect everyone from everything. She wouldn't want you to spend your life punishing yourself." The dam inside Samuel finally broke. He pulled Grace into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear like morning mist. She melted against him, her own arms wrapping around his waist. And for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. When they finally pulled apart, both were shaken by the intensity of the moment. Samuel cleared his throat, stepping back. "I should check the perimeter, make sure we weren't followed." Grace nodded, understanding his need for distance. As he headed for the door, she called after him. "Samuel, we're going to get through this, together." He managed to smile. Together. The day passed quietly. Samuel scouted the surrounding area, finding no sign of pursuit. While Grace organized their supplies and made the cabin more comfortable, they fell into an easy rhythm, like a couple who'd been together for years rather than weeks. As evening approached, storm clouds gathered over the peaks. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the first fat snowflakes began to fall, unusual for early autumn, but not unheard of in the high country. "Looks like we're in for weather," Samuel observed, securing the shutters. By full dark, the storm had intensified. Wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, and snow fell in thick curtains. They huddled near the fire, sharing stories to pass the time. Grace told him about her childhood in Ohio, her father's small congregation, her mother's beautiful singing voice. Samuel found himself opening up about his early days ranching, the struggles and triumphs of building the Triple T from nothing. "I was so proud when I could finally afford to bring Sarah out from St. Louis," he said, staring into the flames. "She was a city girl, used to society and culture, but she took to ranch life like she was born to it. Said the wide open spaces made her feel free." "She sounds wonderful." "She was Emma, too, our daughter, 4 years old, with her mother's smile and my stubborn streak." His voice caught. "The house feels empty without their laughter." Grace moved closer, offering silent comfort. The storm raged outside, but within the circle of firelight, they found peace. It was near midnight when they heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Samuel was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Someone's coming!" Through the howling wind came the distinct sound of horses struggling up the trail. Samuel positioned himself by the window while Grace grabbed the shotgun he'd taught her to use. "Hello, the cabin!" a voice called out. Not Carlyle's men, but familiar nonetheless. "Sam, it's Jake. Let us in before we freeze." Relief flooded through Samuel as he unbarred the door. Jake stumbled in, followed by young Tom Brennan, the marshal's nephew and deputy. Both men were covered in snow and shivering violently. "What the hell are you doing here?" Samuel demanded, helping them to the fire. "Trouble," Jake gasped through chattering teeth. "Big trouble. Carlyle's lost his mind. Sam, after you left, he and his boys hit the ranch, burned the east barn, scattered the remuda. Would have torched the house too, but McCaffrey and his men showed up. Mrs. Chen? Safe. Got her to town before the raid. Jake accepted the coffee Grace offered gratefully. But that ain't the worst of it. Tell him. Tom. The young deputy looked grim. Carlisle's claiming you kidnapped Miss McKenna. Says she was coerced into that release. Judge Harwick's issued new warrants. Federal ones this time. Murder, kidnapping, cattle rustling. They're throwing everything at you. Murder? Grace paled. Who did we supposedly kill? One of Carlisle's men turned up dead this morning. Shot in the back. Carlisle says it was you taking revenge. Tom shook his head. My uncle knows it's false. But with federal warrants, his hands are tied. Every lawman in the territory will be looking for you. Samuel felt the walls closing in. Carlisle had played his hand brilliantly, framed them for crimes. Let the law do his dirty work. How long do we have? Posse's forming up in town. This storm bought you time, but come morning. Jake didn't need to finish. We could make for Colorado, Tom suggested. My uncle has contacts there who might help. No more running, Grace said firmly. We need evidence against Carlisle, something that proves what he really is. The evidence is scattered across the territory in unmarked graves, Jake said bitterly. Not all of it. Grace's eyes lit with a sudden inspiration. Carlisle keeps records. He's too much of a businessman not to. Ledgers, contracts, correspondence. If we could get those, they'd be in his office at the Silver Dollar, Samuel mused. Or at his house. It's suicide. Jake protested. Town's crawling with his men. Then we don't go to town. Grace looked at each man in turn. We make him come to us, on our terms, our ground. The men exchanged glances. It was audacious, probably foolish. But what choice did they have? They were already dead if caught. What did you have in mind? Samuel asked. As the storm raged outside, Grace outlined her plan. It was risky, dependent on Carlisle's arrogance and greed. But it might work, if they were lucky, if they were smart, if they were willing to risk everything. You sure about this? Samuel asked when she finished. Grace met his eyes steadily. My father used to say that David didn't defeat Goliath with strength. He won with faith and a good aim. We have both. Tom and Jake bedded down by the fire while Samuel and Grace talked quietly into the night, refining the plan, preparing for what might be their last stand. Outside, the storm began to break, stars appearing through gaps in the clouds. Whatever happens tomorrow, Grace said softly, I want you to know that these weeks with you, they've meant everything. Samuel took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. We're going to win this, and when we do, I want you to stay. Not because you need protection, but because, he struggled for words, because the Triple T doesn't feel empty when you're there. She squeezed his hand. Then we'd better win. As dawn approached, they prepared for the battle ahead, not with guns and violence, but with cunning and courage. The mountains stood witness to their determination, ancient and unforgiving, but offering the possibility of justice for those brave enough to seek it. The ruins of the Triple T's east barn stood like blackened teeth against the morning sky. Samuel surveyed the damage from the ridge, his jaw tight with controlled fury. Below, riders moved through his property like vultures, Carlisle's men making themselves at home while the law searched for the fugitives. 20 men, maybe 25, Jake observed, passing the field glasses. Carlisle himself is in your house. It had been 3 days since they'd left the mountain cabin, 3 days of careful movement and preparation. Grace's plan required precise timing and iron nerves. Now, seeing his home invaded, Samuel questioned their strategy. You sure about this? Tom Brennan asked, checking his rifle for the dozenth time. No, Samuel admitted. But it's too late for second thoughts. Grace emerged from the tree line, having changed into the tattered dress she'd worn when Samuel first found her. The transformation was startling. She'd rubbed dirt on her face, tangled her hair, and practiced the haunted expression of a captive. It made Samuel's stomach turn to see her like this again. "Remember," she said quietly, "everything depends on Carlisle's greed overcoming his caution. He needs to believe I've been broken, that I'll lead him to something valuable. I still say this is too dangerous." Samuel protested. "Let me go with you. They'll shoot you on sight." But a hysterical woman stumbling out of the wilderness. She managed a grim smile. "They'll want to know what I know first." Jake spat tobacco juice. "Girl's got sand. Sam, let her play it out." They watched Grace make her way down the hillside, her gait deliberately unsteady. When she was halfway to the ranch, she began screaming, a sound that raised the hair on Samuel's neck. Men poured out of buildings, rifles raised, then lowered as they recognized her. Through the field glasses, Samuel watched Hartley grab Grace roughly, shaking her as she babbled incoherently. They dragged her toward the house, and Samuel's finger tightened on his rifle trigger when one man backhanded her. "Steady," Jake murmured. She knew this would happen. Inside the house, Tom Carlyle sat at Samuel's desk, going through papers with the casual arrogance of a conqueror. He looked up with interest as Grace was hauled before him, noting her condition with satisfaction. Well, the runaway returns." He leaned back in Samuel's chair. "Where's Thornton?" Grace cowered convincingly. "Dead. The storm. Horses spooked. Fell into a ravine." "And you survived? How fortunate." Carlyle's voice dripped skepticism. I hid in a cave. Found something." She fumbled in her dress, producing a small leather pouch. With shaking hands, she spilled its contents on the desk. Gold nuggets, just enough to be tantalizing. Carlyle's eyes gleamed as he examined the gold. "Where did you find this?" "The cave. There's more. So much more. Old Spanish treasure, I think." Grace let desperation color her voice. "I'll show you. But you have to promise. Promise to let me go after. I just want to leave. Never come back." "Of course, my dear." Carlyle's smile was predatory. "Show me this cave, and all debts are forgiven." From the ridge, Samuel watched preparations below. Carlyle was taking 10 men, leaving the rest to guard the ranch. Greed had overridden caution, just as Grace had predicted. The Spanish gold was a brilliant touch. Everyone knew the legends of lost conquistador treasure in these mountains. "They're moving," Tom reported. "Northeast, toward Devil's Canyon." "Perfect." Samuel turned to Jake and the 5 Triple T hands who joined them. "You know what to do. Hit them hard and fast once they're in the canyon. Tom, you get to Marshal Brennan. Tell him where to find us. What about Carlyle's men here? Leave them to me." Samuel's smile was cold. "I have business in my own house." They split up, Jake's group shadowing Carlyle's party while Samuel and 2 men circled back toward the ranch. The remaining guards had relaxed, thinking the danger past. 3 were in the bunkhouse playing cards, 2 in the barn, others scattered on lazy patrol. Samuel approached his own home like a thief, using knowledge of every board and shadow. The kitchen door opened silently. He'd oiled those hinges himself last spring. Inside, Mrs. Chen's domain stood empty, pot still on the cold stove. Voices drifted from his study, moving carefully. Samuel peered around the corner. Sheriff Daniels sat nervously in a chair while Judge Harwick pawed through Samuel's private papers. "Thornton keeps detailed records," Harwick was saying. "We'll find something to make the charges stick." "This ain't right, Judge," Daniels protested weakly. "Sam Thornton's no murderer. He's whatever I say he is." Harwick pulled out a stack of letters. "Well, what have we here? Correspondence with railroad executives. Our righteous mister. Thornton seems very interested in progress after all." Samuel stepped into the room, his coat drawn. "Those are private. Judge." Both men froze. Daniels's hand twitched toward his gun, then stilled as Samuel shook his head. "Sam," the sheriff breathed. "They said you were dead." "Disappointed?" "Relieved, actually." Daniels slumped in his chair. "This whole thing stinks worse than a dead skunk." "Shut up, you fool." Harwick snarled. Thornton, you're under arrest for murder, kidnapping. Save it. Judge, I know all about your arrangement with Carlisle. 20% of his earnings for legal protection. Samuel smiled at Harwick's stunned expression. Did you really think those girls never talked? Grace remembered everything. Names, dates, amounts, even where you hide your payoff money. You can't prove anything. No, then you won't mind if Marshal Brennan searches your office safe. Combination is your wife's birthday, isn't it? Harwick went pale. Outside, gunfire erupted. Jake signaled that Carlisle had entered the canyon. The judge jumped at the sound, sweat beading on his forehead. Here's what's going to happen, Samuel continued. You're going to write out a full confession. Every girl Carlisle trafficked, every bribe you took, every false warrant you issued. Sheriff Daniels here will witness it. I won't. Samuel cocked his pistol. I've lost everything that mattered to me once already. Judge, my wife, my daughter, my heart. You think I care about the law anymore? Right, or I'll put you in the ground and let God sort it out. Harwick's hands shook as he picked up the pen. The confession came slowly at first. Then, in a rush, names, places, horrible details of Carlisle's operation. Daniels looked sicker with each revelation. Jesus Christ, Judge, girls as young as 14. I never touched them, Harwick protested. I just facilitated business arrangements. You sold children. Samuel's voice was ice. Keep writing. More gunfire from the canyon. Closer now. Through the window. Samuel saw the remaining guards running toward the sound, leaving their posts. Everything was going according to plan. When Harwick finished, Samuel had Daniels read and sign as witness. Now, Sheriff, you're going to do your job for once. Arrest this man. On what charge? Pick one. Corruption, trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder. I'm sure Marshal Brennan will have suggestions. Daniels straightened, something like relief crossing his weathered features. Judge Harwick, you're under arrest. He pulled out his seldom-used handcuffs. Sam, what about Carlisle? A rider burst into the yard. Jake, his shirt bloody, but his grin wide. Got him bottled up in Devil's Canyon. That girl led them right into the box. Smart as a whip. She is. Anyone hurt? Cooper took one in the shoulder, but he'll live. Grace is safe. Played her part perfect. Soon as the shooting started, she dove behind rocks. Tom's got her now. Relief flooded through Samuel. And Carlisle? Holed up with 4 men behind some boulders. Rest her down or run off. Jake's grin turned savage. He's screaming about the gold, wanting to know where it is. The gold came from Sarah's jewelry. Samuel explained. Had it melted down years ago. Couldn't bear looking at it. Seemed fitting to use it as bait. The sound of many horses announced Marshal Brennan's arrival with a dozen federal deputies. The marshal took in the scene. Harwick in cuffs. Samuel armed but calm. Jake bloodied but victorious. Thornton, you've got some explaining to do. Samuel handed over Harwick's confession. This should clarify things. Marshal, your nephew can tell you the rest. Brennan scanned the document, his expression hardening with each line. Mother of God, Judge, if half of this is true, it's all true. Daniel said quietly. I watched him write it. No coercion beyond what his own conscience provided. Where's Carlisle? Devil's Canyon. Samuel replied, trapped like the rat he is. The final confrontation came as the sun peaked overhead. Carlisle and his remaining men were surrounded. Federal deputies positioned on the canyon rim. The outlaw leader looked smaller somehow, his fine clothes torn and dusty, his face twisted with rage. Thornton, he screamed. Where's my gold? Samuel stood at the canyon's edge, Grace beside him wrapped in a blanket Tom had provided. There never was any gold. Carlisle, just justice catching up. You bastard, you... Carlisle went for his gun. The shot echoed off canyon walls. Carlisle spun and fell, his pistol dropping from nerveless fingers. Marshal Brennan lowered his rifle, smoke curling from the barrel. Tom Carlisle, you're under arrest for trafficking, murder, and attempted murder of a federal officer. Brennan's voice carried clearly, though I doubt you'll live to stand trial. Indeed, Carlisle was breathing his last. blood pooling beneath him. His remaining men threw down their weapons, hands raised in surrender. It was over. As they rode back to the ranch, Grace pressed close against Samuel's side. "We did it," she whispered. "You did it," he corrected. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. I had good reason to be brave." She looked up at him. "I had something worth fighting for. The Triple T bore scars, the burned barn, scattered cattle, the house ransacked. But it still stood, and Samuel's men were already beginning repairs. Misses. Chen met them in the yard, tears streaming as she embraced Grace. "Never scare me like that again, child." That evening, as statements were given and prisoners secured, Samuel found himself on the porch with Grace. The stars were coming out, peaceful after so much violence. "What now?" Grace asked softly. "Now we rebuild. The ranch, our lives." He took her hand. "That is, if you still want to stay. After all this, you couldn't drive me away." She leaned against his shoulder. "Though I might want to avoid caves for a while." Samuel chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. For the first time in 5 years, the future held promise instead of just duty. The Triple T would thrive again, and perhaps so would its owner's heart. The dust had barely settled on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge when the final reckoning began. Tom Carlyle, wounded but not dead as initially thought, had been taken to Doc Morrison's for treatment under heavy guard. The streets buzzed with nervous energy as townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, sensing that the shadow that had loomed over their community might finally be lifting. Samuel stood in the dusty main street, his shirt torn and stained with blood. Not his own, thankfully. Beside him, Marshal Brennan coordinated the roundup of Carlyle's remaining men. Deputies moved through the town with purpose, armed with warrants and witness statements that Judge Harwick's confession had made possible. "Thornton," Brennan called out. "We need to talk about the girl." Grace stepped forward from where she'd been tending to Cooper's shoulder wound. Despite everything she'd endured, she held her head high. "I'm right here, Marshal. Ask your questions." "Miss McKenna, I need a full statement. Everything from the beginning." Brennan's expression was kind but professional. "What you've been through, it's evidence now." "I understand." Grace looked at Samuel, drawing strength from his presence. "Where should we start?" They commandeered the courthouse, Judge Harwick's former domain now serving the cause of actual justice. As Grace recounted her story, her voice growing stronger with each telling, Samuel watched the court reporter's face pale. The young man had to stop several times, overwhelmed by the horrors being documented. "They kept us in a boarding house on Elm Street," Grace continued. "Mrs. Dalton ran it. She pretended to be a kindly widow, but she was the one who drugged the tea when new girls arrived, made us compliant for the interviews with potential employers." "Can you identify this boarding house?" Brennan asked. "The yellow one with green shutters, third from the corner." Grace's hands clenched in her lap. "Mary Patterson tried to escape through a second-story window. They brought her back with a broken ankle, said she fell off a horse." As Grace spoke, Samuel noticed movement outside. A crowd was gathering, women mostly, their faces set in grim determination. Margaret Sinclair stood at their head, the Ladies' Temperance Society banner repurposed with a new message: "Justice for the lost girls." The courthouse door burst open. Sheriff Daniels entered, dragging a struggling woman in black bombazine. "Marshal, caught this one trying to burn papers behind the boarding house." Mrs. Dalton, the supposedly kindly widow who had lured so many girls to their doom. Her facade of respectability had crumbled entirely, revealing the cruel calculation beneath. "You have no proof," she spat. "The word of a fallen woman against mine. We have more than her word," Brennan interrupted. He produced a ledger taken from Carlyle's safe. "Your handwriting, I believe. Quite detailed records of incoming merchandise and outgoing placements. You even noted which girls were virgins, added to their price, apparently." The crowd outside grew louder. Someone shouted, "Bring her out. Let us have her." "None of that," Samuel said firmly. stepping onto the courthouse porch. "We do this legal. That's what separates us from them." Margaret Sinclair pushed forward. "Samuel Thornton, you listen here. 12 girls from our community. Daughters, sisters, friends, gone. And we did nothing because we were afraid. You did what you could. Margaret, you kept records, gathered information. It wasn't enough." Tears streamed down her face. "But we won't be silent anymore. If the law fails again, it won't," Samuel promised. "Not this time." Inside, Carlisle had been brought in on a stretcher, his shoulder heavily bandaged, even wounded and chained. He radiated menace, his small eyes fixed on Grace with murderous intent. "You lying witch," he growled. "I gave you a chance at honest work." "Honest?" Grace stood, trembling but resolute. "You sold Emma Hartley to a mining camp brothel. She was 15 years old. Her mother still lights a candle for her every Sunday, praying she'll come home. Business is business." Carlisle sneered. "Supply and demand." The click of a gun being cocked was shockingly loud. Everyone turned to see Jake standing in the doorway, his old army Colt aimed at Carlisle's head. "Jake, no," Samuel said quietly. "He needs killing. Boss, legal or not, he needs it." Jake's hand was rock steady. "My niece was one of those girls. Rebecca Paulson, sweetest little thing. Came out from Ohio to teach school. Never made it past Laramie." "I remember her," Grace whispered. "Red hair, freckles. She sang hymns to keep our spirits up." "Where is she?" Jake's voice broke. Carlisle laughed. An ugly sound. "How should I know? I don't keep track of every—" The gun roared. The bullet slammed into the floor inches from Carlisle's head, sending splinters flying. Jake stood frozen, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "The next one goes between your eyes," Jake said flatly. "Where's my Rebecca?" "Fort Laramie. Mrs." Dalton blurted out, cracking under the pressure. "She was sent to Fort Laramie 2 months ago. The officers there pay well for educated girls." Marshal Brennan carefully approached Jake, placing a gentle hand on the gun. "We'll find her. Jake, I promise you that, but not like this." The foreman slowly lowered his weapon, shoulders shaking. Samuel gripped his old friend's shoulder, understanding the agony of loss all too well. The trial preparations began immediately. Brennan wanted everything done properly, no grounds for appeal or claims of frontier justice, as witnesses were interviewed and evidence cataloged. A fuller picture emerged of Carlisle's operation, a network extending across 3 territories, involving corrupt officials, businessmen, and military personnel. That evening, Samuel found Grace standing alone in the ruins of his burned barn. The sunset painted everything in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful despite the destruction. "I keep thinking about them," she said softly. "All those girls, where they are, what they're enduring. We saved ourselves. But what about them? Brennan's already sent telegrams. Federal marshals across the territories are investigating. Some will be found, brought home. And the others?" Samuel had no answer for that. They stood together in silence, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. "I need to testify," Grace said suddenly. "Not just give statements, testify in open court. Let everyone hear what happens when they look away. It'll be brutal. Carlisle's lawyer will try to destroy your reputation, make you seem like a willing participant." "I know." She turned to face him, her eyes fierce. "But someone has to speak for the ones who can't. Mary, Emma, Rebecca. They deserve to have their stories told." The attack came that night. Samuel woke to the sound of breaking glass and the acrid smell of kerosene. Fire, the universal tool of frontier vengeance. He grabbed his rifle and boots, racing to the window. Dark figures moved around the house, torches in hand. "Grace!" He burst into her room, finding her already awake and reaching for the shotgun he'd taught her to use. "How many?" she asked, surprisingly calm. 6, maybe 8. Another window shattered downstairs. "Backstairs! Move!" They descended into chaos. The kitchen was already ablaze, flames racing across the kerosene-soaked floor. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, wielding a cast-iron skillet against a masked intruder. Samuel's rifle spoke, dropping the man threatening his housekeeper. "Outside! Everyone!" They fought their way to the yard, where Samuel's cowboys were already engaged. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireflies. A rider charged at Grace. She raised the shotgun and fired, knocking him from his saddle. "The house, Mrs.!" Chen cried. Flames were already licking at the upper windows. 5 years of memories. The last physical connections to Sarah and Emma being consumed. Samuel felt rage build in his chest, not the cold anger of calculation, but something primal. A familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Thornton, face me like a man!" Bill Hartley, Carlisle's chief enforcer, stood in the flickering firelight. His scarred face was twisted with hate, a pistol in each hand. "Your boss is finished, Hartley. Give it up. He ain't my boss anymore." Hartley spat. "This is personal. You cost me everything. My job, my reputation, time to pay." They circled each other while the battle raged around them. Samuel was aware of Grace watching, of his men fighting desperately, of his home burning. But his world narrowed to the man in front of him, the last of Carlisle's poison. Hartley moved first, both guns blazing. Samuel dove, rolled, came up firing. His first shot caught Hartley in the thigh, spinning him around. The second took him center mass. As Hartley fell, his guns discharged into the dirt. "Damn you, Thornton," he gasped. "Damn you to hell? Already been there." Samuel replied quietly, "Trying to find my way out." The remaining attackers fled into the night. Samuel's men gave chase briefly, but were called back to fight the fire. Bucket brigades formed, cowboys and townspeople who'd heard the commotion working together. It was hopeless. The house was fully engulfed, a century of craftsmanship reduced to cinders. Samuel stood watching it burn, feeling strangely empty. Grace appeared at his side, her face streaked with soot and tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come here—" "Don't." He pulled her against him. "Don't you dare blame yourself. This was Carlisle's doing, all of it. Your home, your memories, are here." He touched his chest, then her face. "The things that matter can't be burned. Sarah taught me that. I just forgot for a while." As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, Marshal Brennan arrived with news. Fort Laramie had been raided, 12 girls freed, including Jake's niece. The telegraph lines were burning with reports of similar rescues across the territories. "It's not over," Brennan warned. "Carlisle's got powerful friends. The trial will be a fight. Then we fight," Samuel said simply. He looked around at the gathered faces, his cowboys, battered but unbroken, the townspeople who'd finally found their courage. Grace, beautiful, even covered in ash and exhaustion. His house was gone, but something had been built in its place, a community united against evil. "We rebuild," he announced, "stronger than before, and we make sure nothing like this ever happens again in Cedar Ridge." A cheer went up, tentative at first, then stronger as the sun climbed higher, chasing away the shadows. Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Hope. The final battle was yet to come, in the courtroom rather than the street. But for now, they had won a victory, not just against Carlisle and his organization, but against the fear and silence that had allowed such evil to flourish. Grace squeezed his hand. "Together? Together," he confirmed, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The morning sun painted the Wyoming plains in shades of gold and amber, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost gentle. 6 months had passed since the fire, since the trials that had shaken Cedar Ridge to its foundations, where the old ranch house had stood. A new structure was rising, smaller perhaps, but built with hope rather than mere ambition. Samuel stood with his coffee, watching his men work on the roof framing. The sound of hammers and saws had become a daily symphony, a rhythm of renewal that seemed to echo across the valley. Jake supervised the construction with his usual efficiency, his niece Rebecca at his side, learning to keep the books. The girl had returned from Fort Laramie changed, but not broken, finding purpose in helping other survivors reclaim their lives. "You're going to wear a hole in that porch board if you keep pacing," Grace observed, emerging from the temporary quarters they'd set up in the old foreman's cabin. She looked radiant in the morning light, her dark hair pinned up, wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Chen had made for her. The haunted look had long since left her eyes, replaced by something Samuel treasured more than all his lost possessions: peace. "Just thinking," he replied, setting down his cup to take her hand. About how different this all is. The first time I built a house here, it was to prove something, to the world, to myself. This time," he gestured at the construction, "this time it's about creating something new, not trying to recreate what was lost." Grace squeezed his fingers. "Sarah would be proud of what you've done, what we've all done." The trials had been everything Marshal Brennan warned, and worse. Carlisle, recovered from his wound, had hired the best lawyers territorial money could buy. They'd attacked Grace's character, suggested she was a willing participant who'd changed her mind, implied she'd seduced Samuel for protection. But Grace had stood firm, her testimony clear and damning. Other girls had found the courage to speak too: Rebecca, Emma Hartley, who'd been rescued from the mining camps, others who'd escaped or been freed. Their combined voices had created a chorus that no amount of legal maneuvering could silence. Tom Carlisle had been sentenced to hang Mrs. Dalton received 20 years hard labor. Judge Harwick, stripped of his position, would spend his remaining years in federal prison. The network they'd built had crumbled, its participants scattered to the wind or behind bars. "The new barn's coming along well," Grace observed, shading her eyes to look across the yard. "Robert McCaffrey said his horses should arrive next week." Samuel nodded. The neighboring rancher had become a strong ally, and their plan to crossbreed horses would benefit both spreads. The Triple T was smaller now. Samuel had sold some land to cover legal expenses and rebuilding costs. But it was enough. More than enough. "Mrs. Chen wants to know about the kitchen plans," Grace continued. "She's insisting on a larger pantry this time. Whatever she wants, woman's earned it." Samuel paused, gathering courage for what he'd been meaning to say. "Grace, I've been thinking about the future." She turned to face him fully, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Have you now? The ranch is rebuilding, the cattle operation's profitable again. But a spread like this, it needs—" He cleared his throat. "What I'm trying to say is, I don't want to do this alone anymore. Samuel Thornton, are you proposing to me while covered in sawdust and coffee stains?" He looked down at himself and laughed, the sound coming easier now than it had in years. "I suppose I am, though I had planned something more romantic." "I don't need romantic." Grace stepped closer, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "I need real. I need the man who rode into danger for a stranger, who stood against evil when it would have been easier to look away, who showed me that broken hearts can heal." "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." He kissed her then. There on the half-built porch with construction noise all around and Jake's wolf whistle cutting through the morning air. It wasn't the proposal he'd imagined, but it was perfect in its imperfection, like life itself. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the meadow behind the ranch, with wildflowers blooming and the mountains standing witness. Reverend Patterson, Mary's father who'd come west after learning his daughter's fate, performed the ceremony. The old man had found solace in ministering to the rescued girls, helping them heal in body and spirit. Margaret Sinclair served as matron of honor, the Ladies' Temperance Society having transformed into the Territorial Women's Protection Association. They'd successfully lobbied for new laws against trafficking and established safe houses in 3 cities. Sheriff Daniels, re-elected after his role in bringing down Carlisle, stood with Samuel as best man. The lawman had found his backbone during the trials, becoming the protector Cedar Ridge had always needed. "Do you, Samuel Thornton, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Patterson asked, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I do," Samuel said firmly. his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "And do you, Grace McKenna, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she whispered. Then louder, "I do. Then by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife." The celebration lasted well into the night. Cowboys danced with rescued girls who'd chosen to stay and build new lives in Cedar Ridge. Jake spun his niece around the makeshift dance floor, both of them laughing through tears. Mrs. Chen presided over a feast that seemed to feed half the territory, beaming whenever anyone complimented her cooking. As the evening wound down, Samuel found himself standing with Grace at the edge of the gathering, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate not just a wedding, but a community reborn. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "None," Grace replied. "I came west looking for a new life. I found something better, a purpose, a home, a love I never expected, even with all the danger, the pain, especially because of it." She leaned into his embrace. "We both learned that hiding from life isn't living. Sarah and Emma, all those lost girls, they deserve for us to live fully, to cherish what they can't." A cool breeze swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Running a ranch always did. There would be hard winters and dry summers, market fluctuations, and the eternal struggle against the elements. But tonight, under a canopy of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon, Samuel Thornton held his new wife and felt complete for the first time in years. The Triple T Ranch had been rebuilt not just in timber and stone, but in spirit. Where loneliness had reigned, love now dwelt. Where silence had echoed, laughter now rang. "I love you, Mrs. Thornton," he murmured into her hair. "And I love you, Mr. Thornton," she replied. "Forever and always." As if in benediction, a shooting star streaked across the sky. Some might have called it coincidence, but Samuel preferred to think of it as approval from those who'd gone before. Sarah and Emma, Mary Patterson, and all the others. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. From tragedy had come triumph. From ashes had risen hope. The music played on, fiddle and guitar weaving melodies that drifted across the plains. Cowboys sang old songs of love and loss, their voices rough but sincere. And in the middle of it all, Samuel and Grace danced. Two souls who'd found each other in the crucible of adversity. The Triple T Ranch stood ready for whatever came next. No longer a monument to loss, but a testament to the power of redemption. In the Wyoming territory, where justice had once been for sale and innocence a commodity to be traded, a new chapter had begun. Some stories end with sunset rides into the distance, but this one ended with a sunrise, not an ending at all, but a beginning, as the first light of dawn touched the mountains. Samuel and Grace stood together on their new porch, watching the world wake up. "What are you thinking?" Grace asked. "That I can breathe again." Samuel replied, "For the first time in years, I can breathe." She smiled, remembering her own desperate words in that abandoned shack so many months ago. They'd both been suffocating in their different prisons, his of grief, hers of captivity. Together, they'd found air. The ranch stirred to life around them. Roosters crowed. Horses nickered. Cowboys stumbled from bunkhouses seeking coffee and breakfast. It was an ordinary morning in all the best ways, full of promise and purpose. "Ready for the day?" Grace asked. "Ready for the rest of our lives," Samuel corrected, and meant it. Hand in hand, they walked toward their future, leaving footprints in the dust that the wind would soon erase. But what they'd built together, love, justice, hope, would endure long after their passing, a legacy written not in sand but in the hearts of all those they'd saved and inspired. The Wild West had tried to break them. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger, and in that transformation lay the true treasure. Not gold hidden in caves or wealth measured in cattle and acres, but the ineffable riches of the human spirit triumphant. The end had become a beginning, and the beginning promised to be beautiful. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope you enjoyed following Samuel and Grace's journey from that first desperate rescue to their hard-won happiness. Where are you listening to this story from? I'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier tales of love, courage, and redemption. What did you think of Grace's bravery or Samuel's transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one and love discussing these stories with you.